So, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see some familiar names. I hope to get to see your faces later. Welcome to the final seminar, the Russian Studies seminar series for this term. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce today Dr. Katherine Bowers, who's joining us all the way from Vancouver, which is sort of one of the wonderful things about doing these seminars on Zoom. Katya Bowers is Associate Professor of Slavic Studies at the University of British Columbia, and prior to that she was a Research Associate at Cambridge University, which is where I first met her a few years ago. She works mainly on 19th century literature and culture, and has co-edited, among other books, Russian Writers and the Fin de Siècle, The Twilight of Realism with Annie Kokobovo, a Dostoevsky companion, Text and Context with Connor Doak and Kate Holland, who's joining us today as well, I see. And Katya and Kate have also co-edited the forthcoming volume, Dostoevsky at 200, the novel in modernity, which is being published next year by Toronto University Press, and which I'm very happy to have an essay. Katya's monograph, Writing Fear, Russian Realism and the Gothic, is also due out with Toronto University of Toronto Press next year. And she'll be speaking, the topic she'll be speaking about today is related to a chapter from that book. So without further ado, I'd like to sort of invite Katya to begin her presentation. In fact, actually, there is further ado before we get to that. I'll just mention for the question and answer session at the end, you can either put questions in the chat, and I will read those out for Katya, or you can turn your cameras and mics on and talk to us directly, which we would actually quite like, because it's quite nice to see people's faces, and it's not a sort of enormous audience, so I think that will be perfectly manageable. But if you want to do that, do remember that the session is being recorded, so that your face will appear on the recording. So yes, that's my further ado, but now I'd like to invite Katya to begin her presentation, A Russian Jane Eyre, Gothic Subjectivity and the Woman Question in Tur and Turgenev.
So thank you very much, Sarah. I'm sharing my screen, which will hopefully appear momentarily. There we go. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for coming to hear my talk. I know at least one of you has heard this talk or a version of it before, but this is from my favorite chapter of my book, and I'm excited to hear what you all think of it. So I should say that I have also on my slides, I'm going to be reading out the English translations, but I have both the Russian and the English for most slides. You will notice that the Russian is in the old orthography, and this is deliberate. And this is because the book that I'm talking about has not been published in Russia since 1851. So I wanted to kind of emphasize the fact that Yevgenia Tour's work would be better known, I think, if it had been published more recently, or if it had been republished more recently. And it should be, because it's fantastic. So to start out, I would like to give you two quotes. These are kind of like the epigraph. They are similar, as you'll see. The similar themes. So from Jane Eyre, I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will. And then from Yevgenia Tour's Antonina, which is one part of her novel Plemianitsa, the niece, all my hope rests now on gaining the only blessing still accessible to me, independence, and consequently together with it peace. And with that, I will start my talk. The rise of Gothic writing in England and France is linked to debates about the rights of women in the late 18th century, while the genre's transmission onto the Russian literary scene is not. Yet, in both Western European and Russian cultural contexts, the Gothic genre is characterized by women's writing and women's reading. A significant number of the notable early Gothic novelists who established the genre's conventions through their writing and then were imported into Russia were women. Clara Reeve, whose novel The Old English Baron was the first translated into Russian in 1792, Sophia Lee, Charlotte Docker, and of course Anne Radcliffe, to name a few. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her feminist treatise, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, just a year after Radcliffe published The Romance of the Forest, and 2 years before Radcliffe's masterpiece, The Mysteries of Udolpho. Wollstonecraft also wrote novels of her own, which begin within the realm of the sentimental and quickly veer into the Gothic. As Diane Long Hoveler has observed, quote, female Gothic ideology originated in the hyperbolic gestures and the frenzied poses of victimage that tipped these novels over the edge from sentimentality into Gothicism, end quote. The exploration of victimhood, captivity, and the power structures and injustices it reveals is central to scholarship of the female Gothic. An alternative to the narrative of entrapment is female subjectivity, that is, the experience of existing within one's own consciousness. In the Gothic tradition, Anne Radcliffe's writing most famously uses this trope. Her heroines find themselves imprisoned, but they are able to transcend physical captivity through mental flights that take them to sublime heights. This interior process also includes a spatial trajectory. The heroine, moving within her imprisoning structure, repeatedly shifts from the cell to the consolatory turret, that is, a tower from which she takes in a panoramic view. This movement invariably takes place within the prison, but still affords the heroine a feeling of freedom prompted by the sublime vista. In The Italian, for example, Elena finds a means to mentally escape her imprisonment through the discovery of a tower room with a view. When she sees this view, the reader learns that its, quote, grandeur awakened all her heart. The consciousness of her prison was lost, while her eyes ranged over the wide and freely sublime scene without. To Elena, whose mind was capable of being highly elevated or sweetly soothed by scenes of nature, the discovery of this little turret was an important circumstance. Hither she could come, and her soul, refreshed by the views it afforded, would acquire strength to bear her with equanimity through the persecutions that might await her, end quote. This experience sets a boundary between inner and outer life. Elena's physical imprisonment and her mental freedom. Her freedom of mind, however, is tightly connected to a sense of rejuvenation that prepares her for future travails. A Russian example of this phenomenon appears in Karolina Pavlova's lyrical novel, A Double Life, Dvojная жизнь, published in 1852, in which the heroine retreats from the whirl of society life each evening to the quiet of her private bedroom, removes her mental corset, umsvini korset, and engages in poetic creation prompted by a visiting muse. Female subjectivity's connections to both elements of freedom and of the Gothic is a frequent trope in literary depictions of women's inner lives. Gothic subjectivity, in which the subjective experience becomes a conduit for the uncanny, the terrifying, and the transgressive, is one way of asserting women's agency in narrative. Hoveler suggests a gendered definition of the term. In her formulation, Gothic subjectivity refers both to the nightmare that is the location of the masculine self in the decaying, corruptible, dying human body, as in, perhaps the best example of this, the picture of Dorian Gray, and to, quote, the majority of female Gothic texts in which there is a railing against the physical body and endorsement instead of the life of the mind, reason, spirit, and intellect, end quote. Carolyn Jersey Ayers observes that in moments of Gothic subjectivity, quote, the boundaries of the self are fluid, the integrity of the self is questioned, the Gothic tonality serves to express an anxiety about the position of the self in the world, end quote. In its preoccupation with fear, anxiety, and transgression, the Gothic enables a narrative exploration of the subject that breaks out of the limits imposed by the confines of the physical body and the integrity of the self, but also, by extension, hierarchies predicated on social identity, tradition, and the law. In this sense, Gothic subjectivity carries not only a kind of freedom, but also the possibility of imagining alternative social models in which women have more rights and opportunities. As a genre associated with women's practices of writing and reading, the Gothic functions particularly well as a conduit for discussions of women's situation in society, and by extension, women's education. After all, a significant strand of Gothic fiction is predicated on the dangers that an uneducated or a too sheltered woman faces in the world. While the same themes emerge in Gothic fiction by Nikolai Karamzin, Maria Izviakova, and Nadezhda Durova, and other Russian writers who drew direct inspiration from the English Gothic, the connection between Gothic writing and women's agency has not emerged significantly as part of critical scholarship around the genre in Russian studies. This talk then aims to bridge that gap. Today, we'll examine the way female subjectivity in early Russian realist prose is articulated using Gothic imagery, focusing at length on Yevgeny Tur's Antonina, which was published in 1851 in the journal Komieta, and its intertextual relationships with Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, as well as Ivan Turgenev's Diary of a Superfluous Man, Dnevnik Lishного Человека, which was published in 1850. In the 19th century, women's critical discourse appeared most frequently within the medium of literary fiction. As I will argue, Gothic subjectivity in this context creates spaces in which women's agency and independence is possible. So here is a short kind of plan for the talk, so you can kind of follow along through this. So I'm going to get started with the Bronte and Tur section. There we go. So here we have a picture on the left of the Bronte sisters and on the right of Yevgenia Tur. She's in the far left wearing the blue dress with the red shawl, and her two sisters. Jane Eyre caused a stir when it was published in Russia in 1849 to 1850. Bronte's novel appeared in 3 different versions in short succession: a summary with translated excerpts in the Library for Reading in April 1849, a full translation in Fatherland Notes beginning in May 1849, and a second summary with translated excerpts in the Contemporary in 1850. The anonymous author of the literary narrative account of the novel in the Library for Reading emphasizes the centrality of inner life and emotion that characterizes Bronte's works in speculation about the work's authorship, musing, quote, "Who wrote these impassioned and fluent pages? The subject and details of this book compel us to believe readily that Jane Eyre is the product of a woman's pen. But no matter who the author, no matter which merits earned him renown and success with a first publication, only one thing strikes the reader: the high literary and energetic local character of the novel," unquote. Emotion is at the forefront of the characterization of the novel and its author, who is assumed to be a woman. In the preface to the translation in Fatherland Notes, the translator I. Vidensky contrasts the pseudonymous author of Jane Eyre with Thackeray, the author of Vanity Fair, and notes that the two works approach the same theme and plot, but from such radically different perspectives that Jane Eyre absolutely must be the work of a woman. This characterization of women's style and topics in prose writing is by no means surprising in mid-19th century Russian belles lettres. Indeed, women's writing, audience, and emotionality were so clearly delineated that Vidensky's translation renders the famous line, "Reader, I married him," as "Chitatelnitsa, woman reader, I married him." When Jane Eyre and Antonina appeared in Russian journals in 1850 to 51, the woman question had not yet risen to prominence in Russia. It would only do so in the mid-1850s. In the 1830s and 40s, however, critical discussions about women's role in Russian society were taking place. Barbara Engel traces these discussions to male reformers and radicals' self-reflection in the wake of the 1825 Decembrist Revolt, and their ensuing recognition of, quote, "the connection between the autocratic political order, which they opposed, and the patriarchal family that subordinated women and children to men," end quote. As they worked to reconcile this inconsistency in their program through democratization of the family, they first exalted women and then later, quote, "tried to create equality between the sexes," end quote, through debate. These discussions were connected particularly with the role of women within the family and the potential of a shift in women's roles for revitalizing Russian society more broadly. However, while the debates about women's roles took place in literary salons and publicistica, the average upper-class Russian woman was not touched by them. It was in this context that Yevgenia Tur was hailed as a major new literary talent when her first novel, The Mistake, Ashibka, was published in the Contemporary in 1849, the same year Jane Eyre was first published in Russia. Her follow-up novel, The Niece, Plemianitsa, appeared in 1851. While The Niece received mixed reviews, Part 3, which Tur published as a standalone novella called Antonina, also in 1851, was universally lauded by critics. Ivan Turgenev wrote of it, quote, "These pages will remain in Russian literature," end quote, and praised its ability to arouse deep sympathy and the, quote, "simple feeling and aspiring sincere passion," end quote, of its form. Tur's works contemporaneous with Bronte's in Russia invited critical comparison, particularly as both writers were noted for their depiction of emotion. Like Jane Eyre, Antonina relates the first-person history of its heroine's neglected childhood, her experiences working as a governess, the travails of separation from her true love, Michel, and her later marriage to a businessman. The novel takes Jane Eyre as a significant point of inspiration, not just in Antonina's experiences, but also in its details. While Jane is orphaned and raised first by relatives who despise her and then in a boarding school, Antonina's orphanhood leaves her under the guardianship of not one, but two villainous step-parents. Antonina's abusive English stepfather is called Millcote, a reference to the village near Thornfield Hall, Millcote. Jane Eyre and Antonina are works about young women growing up and finding family. In both, education is of primary importance. Both relegate the histories of a governess for whom both relate the histories of a governess for whom education enables a means of forging a life independent of a family. While the experience of education in each is a trial, Jane's experience at Lowood is harsh and deprived, while Antonina's education with her step-parents is characterized by abuse. Both heroines are grateful that education allows them to escape into a self-sufficient position. While Antonina and Jane Eyre are intertextually linked, the differences between the two are significant. The majority of Jane's time spent at Thornfield exposes her to the Gothic mysteries that are central to Bronte's novel, such as the brooding Edward Rochester and the famous madwoman in the attic, his first wife, Bertha Mason. Jane's escape onto the Yorkshire moors brings her to family life with her newly found cousins, but a mysterious voice calls her back to Rochester. This Gothic framework plays a significant role in Jane Eyre's structure and plot, but it seems to be largely absent from Tor's novella. The majority of Antonina's time in her step-parents' care is spent planning her escape, first into service as a governess at a neighboring estate, and then into marriage. However, when her marriage plans are thwarted by her groom's weakness and inability to oppose his aunt's wishes, Antonina goes back into service. Eventually, she attracts an Italian businessman, but she cannot return his love. She marries him, but his jealous passion for her destroys their marriage. However, in the end, both Jane and Antonina find a kind of happiness in their children and in creating the kind of family structure that neither had growing up. As I will demonstrate, Tor's engagement with Gothic narrative devices constitutes another link with Bronte's novel. In Antonina, subjectivity grants her heroine freedom of expression and agency. In an early scene, which also makes explicit the work's connection to Jane Eyre, Antonina has a transformative reading experience. The gothically tinged scene conflates two scenes in Bronte's novel, the escapism of solitary reading and the terror of the Red Room. Quote, I see myself in a large, cold, towering room. It's dark all around me. A bright fireplace stands along one side. A dim candle burns in the corner. The glow of the fire, red and flickering, flares up and dies down, at times brightly illuminating objects in the room, casting their long pale shadows on the lacquered parquet. Ancient portraits on the walls stare sternly from their darkened once gilded frames. In the clear reflection of the flames, they exert a powerful grip on my childish sensibility and frighten me. I sit cowering in one corner of the room completely alone. I'm cold and afraid, end quote. The red glow of the fire and the fear of ancestors' grim glares recalls the Gothic scene when Jane is locked in the Red Room where her uncle died and becomes so overwrought and frightened she faints. Crucially for both Jane and Antonina, Gothic exaggeration marks subjective experience, an emotional space which centers the young heroines in their stories as much as the first-person narration does. The Gothic description of the flickering fire's shadows and Antonina's fear echoed Jane's terrified hallucination of her dead uncle. Where in Jane Eyre, aborted reading leads to Jane's imprisonment in the Red Room, in Antonina, the terror of the Red Room is dispelled through the pleasure of reading. Quote, I sit down on a little bench that has been left next to the fire and sink into a reverie. Far off like an echo, I hear loud shouting and children running in the next room. My stepmother can't leave them alone, so I'm completely safe. Then I surrender entirely to the pleasure of physical well-being. A book lies on my lap, my hands folded on it, but my eyes are fixed on the fire and follow the flickering flames, they're bending and curling. Suddenly a harsh, robust voice resounds behind me, end quote. Antonina's escapist reading forges a safe space for herself in the household where she can indulge in her rich inner life. Antonina's intertext with Jane Eyre is predicated on these moments of subjective liberation, often tied to the appearance of Gothic narrative cues within the text. Whereas Bronte's Jane Eyre inspired Antonina, as seen in the Gothic intertextual nodes linking the two texts, Tour's novella responds to Turgenev's Diary of a Superfluous Man, which brings us to part 2 of the talk. Tour first met Turgenev in November 1850 when he attended her well-regarded literary salon. At the time of their meeting, Tour was widely regarded as Russia's leading female author, and that's a quote. Turgenev's recent novella, Diary of a Superfluous Man, impressed Tour so much so that she wrote Turgenev a letter and suggested that they write together, like co-write something together. Turgenev's response has been lost, and the two have never shared authorship, but Tour's suggestion demonstrates both the high esteem in which she held Turgenev's writing and her openness and desire to engage with the ideas raised in his novella. Diary of a Superfluous Man is a narrative told from its young, dying hero's perspective. Cholka recounts several instances from his life in a series of diary entries, describing his inability to feel connected with others, and in particular, his unrequited love for Lisa. Cholka despair in the face of Lisa's obvious distaste for him and visible love for Prince N serves to further alienate him. In the formulaic context of the superfluous man's narrative domain, as in A Hero of Our Time or Oblomov, women play active roles, but often their narrative function is to contrast with the hero's passivity and inability to fulfill his intentions. In Jehan Gaith's analysis, Tour's supplementation, this is her word, supplementation, of Turgenev's novella in Antonina attacks two fundamental aspects of the superfluous man's narrative, his alienation and the dependency of the heroine's story. Gaith argues that by centering the experience of the heroine in Antonina, Tour recalibrates the superfluous man's story and ascribes agency to the heroine. Her juxtaposition of the two texts reveals Tour's authorial choices in undermining the superfluous man narrative. Examining the Gothic intertextual nodes shared by the two texts, however, adds an additional layer of meaning as they reveal Turgenev's hero's not just ambivalent, but actively destructive feelings towards his own inner life. By contrast, Tour uses Gothic subjectivity to differentiate between dangerous and safe spaces for her heroine and to craft a protective inner world that can withstand external pressures and structures bent on destruction. In this way, using Gothic subjectivity, Tour not only revises Turgenev's superfluous man narrative model to center women's experiences, but also takes the superfluity chosen by Cholka and generates a model wherein her heroine can choose superfluity on her own terms, or can choose connectivity. In Diary of a Superfluous Man, Gothic subjectivity enters the narrative when the protagonist is overwhelmed with emotion. In one scene, and there are a number of these scenes in the text, rage changes the protagonist into a Spanish bandit hidden in the shadows waiting for his victim. Quote, I swore to myself, wrapping my cloak about me like a Spaniard, to emerge from some corner and stab my happy rival, and imagined Lisa's despair with brutal joy. But first, in the town of O, such corners were few. And second, with the timber fence, the street lamp, and the police on duty in the distance, no, in such a corner it's somehow much more decent to sell buns than to shed human blood, unquote. Here, his imagined landscape and dangerous persona is immediately refuted, first by the realia of Cholka location, and then by the realia that surrounds him, finally by the inflexibility of the realist narrative to provide a more exciting alternative. The shift from Gothic narrative to the mundane happens in nearly the same breath as his imagined fancy in each case. Here it is a part of the same sentence, connected with meaning-laden ellipses and a conjunction. Each time, Gothic signals a fissure in the narrative fabric that allows a glimpse into deeper emotion, but each time the text's realism resists these intrusions. Even on the point of death, everyday objects interrupt the vision of abstract terror he imagines. Quote, I'm terrified, mnie żutka. Yes, I'm terrified, half hanging over the silent gaping abyss. I shudder, turn away with eager attention, inspect at everything about me. Every object is twice as dear to me. I don't look at my poor dull room, saying farewell to every speck on my walls, unquote. Cholka uses Gothic narrative, just as he uses other genres, including the romance in his diary, to manipulate his readers. But the glimpse into the depths of his emotion seems believable. One could argue that Cholka wry use of Gothic narrative devices serves to distance himself from the reality of his impending death, creating a situation in which internal life cannot be sustained from the constant distractions of daily life, and he is rendered superfluous to his own subjective self. By contrast, Antonina explores Gothic emotion in a more balanced way. Tor's novella contains two contrasting types of affective engagement with Gothic subjectivity. The first, a sense of oppression characterized by fear, is evident in the fear Antonina feels when the portraits in the Red Room, representative of those who alienate her, the rightful denizens of the house, seem to gaze down at her in the library. In scenes in this vein, the oppressor takes on the guise of Gothic villain. The portraits in the library stare sternly down, and in their powerful grip she feels fear. In this vein, she feels horror and disgust towards those who oppress her, first and foremost her stepfather, but also her fiancé's overbearing aunt and her husband, eventually. At the root of these feelings, however, is what Tor describes as, quote, instinctual fear, unquote, instinktivny ispug, or instinctively felt fear, quote, ja nivolna ispugalis, end quote. For example, when her stepmother first introduces her new stepfather, Antonina observes, quote, how can I express what I experienced at that moment? I felt dread and bitterness. I was filled with indescribable horror mixed with disgust and anger, end quote. Similarly, in Counting Michelle's aunt, Antonina feels instinctual fear, but first likens her to Lady Macbeth, remarking that, quote, she has neither soul nor heart, end quote. Michelle's aunt in this scene holds sway over Antonina's future. It is she who withholds her blessing from her nephew's engagement to Antonina. Instinctual fear throughout the novel refers to a prescient feeling of fear, a fear of an anticipated future trauma. This Gothic representation of oppression exists in parallel to a Gothic representation of inner life. A second affective manifestation of Gothic subjectivity carries a more positive connotation. Just as Antonina's fears in the library give way to an escapist reverie, so too are emotions she cherishes, like love, couched in Gothic imagery throughout the novella. Antonina's Gothic inner life is populated by ghosts. First and foremost, the still vital memory of her father, a gateway to her inner world that functions the same as music or reading. She describes him in her memories as, quote, a pale poetic figure with a melancholy face and wonderful eyes, end quote, which seem to follow her everywhere. Antonina imagines an aesthetically Gothic portrait of her father, but in his case, the uncanny gaze of the dead does not provoke her fear, only, quote, love and nourishment, end quote. When Antonina falls in love with Michel at first sight, her love is awakened by his voice, which, quote, reminded her of the remote, unfamiliar resonance of her father's voice, still vital, perpetually pleasant, stored deep within her soul, end quote. In this way, both Michelle and her father become indelibly associated with her safe inner life. Where Antonina's inner life is a safe space, fear emerges when her inner life spills out into her external life. This is apparent, for example, when Antonina and Michelle set in motion their first plan to spend time together at a house party. When Michelle once again meets Antonina after an absence of 3 weeks, the abrupt question of Michelle's aunt, who is also Antonina's employer, emphasizes the intrusion of reality into their dreamy reunion. Yeah. Then he said that his grandmother was organizing a gathering of all her members for Shrovetide. There would be carriage rides and masquerades. She was eager to amuse him before his departure. Are you going somewhere? Asked Michelle's aunt. Quote, I felt a deathly chill run down my spine. I sat still as if I'd turned to stone, end quote. Antonina's reaction seems unprovoked by the discussion of a house party that precedes it. The feeling of fear could be attributed to a premonition related to Michelle's imminent departure, but Antonina and Michelle have just planned for their reunification, and this conversation precisely follows that plan. So what is the source of this fear? Antonina feels this fear each time her inner world and external life seem to come together, as if only in keeping them entirely separate can she retain the safe freedom of her internal reverie. In another instance, where Antonina's internal and external life clash, terror intrudes on her inner world and destroys it. On the eve of her planned elopement with Michelle, Antonina has this dream of her father. Quote, I saw my father. He appeared pale and sad just as on the night before his death. Twice he said my name, calling me. I struggled between a desire to follow him and a desire to remain behind for Michelle, whom I was expecting. My father summoned me several times and finally disappeared, moving down a winding road. I rushed after him and suddenly found myself amid a desert and quicksand. I was completely alone and feeling very tired, but I advanced indomitably under the burning sun and stifling heat. I looked everywhere for my father, but couldn't find him. My energy exhausted, I tried to return home, but couldn't find the way out. I awoke exhausted and sighed deeply as I escaped this painful nightmare. End quote. This dream is a peculiar one for Antonina, in that elsewhere her dreams and reveries always represent her safe space. Her father's desertion of her inner world in the face of Antonina's indecisiveness leaves her isolated. Whereas typically isolation is a positive experience for Antonina, one that allows her free reign over her inner life. When her inner world becomes isolating, it is destroyed as a safe space and becomes instead just another space that requires escape. After this dream, Michelle no longer inhabits her safe space, and his connection with her father's memory seems severed. Years later, after the failed elopement and her marriage to another, Antonina encounters Michelle by chance and is surprised that she feels trembling horror and agitation, feelings she associates most readily with her oppressors, her stepfather and her husband. Antonina's horror at meeting him viscerally demonstrates the change that has taken place within her to the reader. Horror, a key Gothic affect, manifests here because she encounters Michelle, formerly tightly connected to her inner life, in the external world as an other being, and therefore uncanny, familiar, and yet alien. This peculiar dream has a parallel Gothic scene in Diary of a Superfluous Man. Chulkaturin sees Lisa in church several weeks after she has apparently been jilted by Prince N. He describes her as corpse-like, quote, that pale face, that extinguished glance, pagashi vzor, those sunken spalia cheeks, end quote. These three features echo the description of his mother's corpse from the beginning of the novel, quote, with half-open lips, sunken apavshia cheeks, and meekly fixed eyes, end quote. The phrasing invites comparison between the mother's corpse and Lisa as a living corpse. Where the mother's eyes are meek, Lisa's are extinguished, as if the prince's abandonment has metaphorically killed her. For Chulkaturin, both images signal the final moments for the women within his consciousness. His mother is buried, and after seeing Lisa, he deems her lost, and afterward observes that she is nothing like the girl he knew. Being tricked and exploited serves to force Lisa to grow up, but there is no space for her suffering or emotion in Chulkaturin's diary. The Gothic moments only serve to alienate women or enact metaphorical violence upon them, and her real trauma remains unexplored and as a result unresolved. Diary of a Superfluous Man uses Gothic to create spaces that are unsafe for women, whose inner lives are of little concern in the narrative. Gothic affective moments in Antonina revise this model, generating a framework that clearly demarcates oppressive and safe environments. Gothic narrative markers identify both, but feelings of horror, disgust, and above all fear characterize the external world, while reverent memories of the heroine's dead father color her inner life. In the end, her Gothic inner life enables Antonina both to persevere through her unhappy marriage, her stepfather's machinations, and her family's bankruptcy, and even to forge the space that enables her to correct her own tortured upbringing through maternal love for her daughters. But where Jane seizes her own happiness, and in so doing throws off the Gothic shadows that have oppressed her, Antonina embraces her Gothic inner life as a source of strength and resilience. Inner life creates a space of true belonging. Which brings us to part 3 of the talk. The echo of Jane Eyre's domestic bliss in the end of Antonina may strike an odd chord with readers who are familiar with Tor's review of Elizabeth Gaskell's The Life of Charlotte Bronte, which it's possible I'm the only one here that's familiar with. In Miss Bronte, Her Life and Works, Miss Bronte Joжизнь и сочинение from 1858, Tor speaks scathingly of marriage. And this is a quote from her review. Mrs. Bronte, that is, Charlotte Bronte's mother, was not only submissive but also timid, and we know that she never tried to fight or complain in her role and carried out all her husband's orders precisely, without departing from them a single step. Women of weak character, overrun and crushed by the mighty will of the man, not only do not recognize their slavery, but also love it, and if they call it dependence, it is not just necessary, but also absolutely natural and ordinary. Quote. However, in the end of Antonina, the importance of Gothic subjectivity comes to the fore as it has created a safe space where the heroine can assert her will and thus not fall into the kind of role Tor suggests Bronte's mother held, one of subjugation and dependence. The ability to create this narrative space for Tor is the mark of Bronte's talent and the validation of women's writing. Tor's review of Gaskell's biography is a direct response to Turgenev, whose review of Tor's novel The Niece had made some strong gender-driven points around the dichotomy between feeling and what he called objective truth or objectiveness. Turgenev's review of The Niece may have lauded Antonina as, quote, the pages that will remain in Russian literature, unquote, but his praise of the work's ability to arouse strong feelings feeds into a paradigm in which women's writing, characterized as laden with emotion, is juxtaposed with men's writing, which is more objective. This distinction emerges from the same culturally embedded line of reasoning that caused the translator of the first Russian version of Jane Eyre to assume the novel was written by a woman, namely the association of emotion and feeling with women's literary voices. In this review essay, Turgenev identifies women writers exemplified by Tor, as well as Yelena Gahn and George Sand, as having an undeveloped, unprofessional talent. Women are not afraid to, quote, fill dozens of pages with either unnecessary reasoning or narratives that are irrelevant or just blathering. They are not afraid to make a mistake, unquote. Women write, quote, greedily, quickly, with some kind of involuntary respect for writing generally, but without literary routines or planning, end quote. Turgenev asserts that such writing holds value, but is not literary, remarking, quote, we are very happy Mrs. Tor is what she is, and the reason for that is simple. Mrs. Tor is a woman, a Russian woman, and no matter how great our respect for this much vaunted objectivity, the thoughts, heart, and voice of a Russian woman, all this is dear and close to us. Don't think that we demand of the woman writer some kind of unconscious, instinctive creativity, a thought with all its suffering and joy, life with all its visible and indivisible secrets. These are available to her as much as to a man. We only claim that in female talents, and we do not exclude the highest of them, George Sand, there is something wrong, неправильное, non-literary, нелитературное, running straight from the heart, not thought out in the end, in a word, something without which they would not attempt much. They would not attempt much, including, among other things, a 4-volume novel, end quote. Turgenev's review of The Niece critiques the novel's length, word choice, characters, and plots. He complains that it should have been significantly reduced before publication. The elements of the novel that Turgenev praises are largely its nuanced depiction of feeling. Quote, the novel is written from the heart and speaks to the heart, end quote, he says. This appraisal of Tor's work seems to echo Turgenev's original impression of her upon their first meeting. In a letter to Pauline Viardot, he describes Tor as, quote, a delightful, prelesnaya woman with a great intellect and talent, end quote. And Riley notes, quote, although she is a writer, she is not a blue stocking, end quote. In his next letter, he again praises Tor, quote, she is witty, good, and genuine. In her manners, there is something that reminds me of you. We are great friends. Мы с ней большие друзья. She is not young, not good looking, but is so likable that you immediately feel at ease with her. And besides, she indeed has a real talent, end quote. For Turgenev, the main aspects of Tor that seem to have made an impression are her talent and her emotional intelligence, which go hand in hand. He concludes his review by calling Tor's talent a true talent, quote, истинный талант, end quote. Turgenev's talent is perhaps not meant to Turgenev's review is perhaps not meant to be dismissive, but in categorizing women's writing as emotional and focused on the subjective, and juxtaposing this category with a talent that exists independently of subjective experience and is connected with professional authorship, he articulates a hierarchy in which women writers are firmly in second place. The disagreement between Turgenev and Tor that emerges from between the lines of these reviews aligns with broader discourse related to women's roles in society taking place during the 1830s and 40s. During this time, discussions related to women's roles focused on those few women who rose to public prominence, for example, salon hostesses and women writers. And I should mention that Yevgenia Tor was both. She was a woman writer and she was also the hostess of a very famous literary salon. as the predominant location of early 19th century intellectual and cultural life, and a space where men and women could interact both socially and intellectually as equals, the salon provided women a means to be recognized for, and even to gain social status, by excelling in intellectual pursuits. The obverse of the salon hostess was the woman writer. While salon hostesses were celebrated, early 19th century Russian women writers fell into a more ambiguous cultural position. Yelena Gon, for example, writing about her experiences as a woman writer in 1839, complained, quote, "But here people look at me just like a crocodile in flannel or a dancing monkey. People look at me as if I were a fairground fright," end quote. While women were indelibly bound up in Russian cultural life of the early 19th century, the woman writer's experience was one that Evgenia Stroganova, writing about Gon, has described as, quote, "emotional trauma," end quote. Turgenev's review of the niece demonstrates a lack of understanding of Tor's position and the challenges she faced in publishing at all. Tor turned to professional writing as a means of supporting herself and her children after her husband's expulsion from Russia, and by the time she was reviewing Gaskell's biography of Bronte in 1856, she was not only established as a novelist, but also employed as the head of the fiction section for Katkov's thick journal, The Russian Messenger. Tor's comments on Bronte's career as a popular woman writer, who was respected for her talents, carry an additional message, a rebuttal to Turgenev's review of her own Bronte-inspired novel. Quote, "For women whose lives are broken, the writer's career opens a new horizon. It gives them a new life. If reality refused them anything, or even worse, if it ruthlessly tore the best treasure of their soul and heart from them, they will recreate their own reality, fulfill their dreams in the fictional characters of the novel. In this way, reliving again the lost joys and sorrows, they will destroy, or at least soften and mitigate their personal suffering. Writing offers more than satisfaction. It is a kind of reward, the rebirth of the whole being," end quote. Here, Tor, perhaps drawing from personal experience, connects the writer's craft with selfhood. The writer, and specifically the writer who is able to engage with the world of emotions, has the possibility for transformation of self. Tor's review seems to agree with Turgenev's valorization of women's ability to write feelings and to write from personal experience, but the subtext of her discussion of Bronte's craft is that women's writing is as equally valuable as men's. Tor concludes her review with warm praise for Bronte's ability both to engage readers on an emotional level and to effect social change as a result of it. Quote, "How many hearts throughout Europe responded to her complaints, doubts, suffering, indignation? Charlotte's heart beats and trembles on every page of her work and attracts the hearts of all readers. Whatever you say, the so-called subjective talents are especially attractive in this capacity. They speak more to the heart than to the mind. Touch a person's heart and he draws closer to correction and change. Touch the heart of people and be certain that you're doing good work and that your voice is not lost in the wasteland," end quote. For Tor, deploying Gothic subjectivity in her prose provides a framework that has the potential to generate social change well beyond the boundaries of the text. Although published before the main debates about the women question began in Russia, Antonina, through its engagement with Gothic subjectivity and articulation of the need for alternative social models, puts forward the view which she voiced later in the 1860s in critical writing. Tor blamed Russian society for its lack of viable options for women's development. For her, the woman question is not a question of whether women should be educated, but a question of how Russian society must change to accommodate women's agency in its social fabric. And for Tor, writing emotional lives is the first step in this process. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Katya, for a really, really wonderful talk. It was also incredibly rich discussion of some really connections that I certainly didn't know about. And that have got me interested in all sorts of things. I'm sort of now thinking particularly where one might fit Nyetochka Nyazvanova into all of this.
Yeah, precisely. And actually, I mean, between Nyetochka and Tor and Jane Eyre, there are all these connections, which are extremely, extremely interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'd like to open up to questions. If you can either sort of raise a hand or just turn your camera on and I'll see you, or you can put questions in the chat. I'm sure lots of people must have questions for Katya.
I would also like to say, kind
Sorry.
of as we're going along, sorry, Lisa, one sec, that so there is an English translation of Antonina, which is by Michael Katz, but the novel itself, Plemianitsa, and the shorter novella, Antonina, has not been published in Russian since 1851. And I do have them in PDF, so if anyone would like that, please email me. I'm very happy to spread to her around. Everyone should be reading her, she's fantastic.
I certainly would, and I would also, if you have it, really rather like her review of the Elizabeth Gaskell as well.
Yeah, I have that, although there's also a copy of it on lib.ru.
Oh, right, thank you, thank you. Lisa Wren, would you like to turn your camera and mic?
So I actually loved the talk. Thanks, Dr. Bowers. It was great. I was wondering, what do you think? I know you mentioned some of the reviews that Turgenev was talking about when he was talking about Tour, and you mentioned at the beginning how she was considered quite a well-known writer by this period. Mm-hmm. Was this still within the context of the woman question and women just being placed as sort of second in terms of her writing? Like, was she great just in the context of being a woman, or was she just considered widely as a really well-known writer in what she was doing with ideas?
So she was very well known and very well read in the 1850s. So people say that, you know, she was the top woman writer, but she was also very widely read across that. And at the point when Turgenev is going to her literary salon, she is substantially more well known than he is. So she's kind of like the more famous one, because his Zapiski Ochotnika, the thing that kind of cemented his fame, the what's it called, Huntsman Sketches, or Sketches from a Hunter's Album. These are only starting to come out. So like some of them had come out, but they hadn't been published as like the full volume yet. But the yeah. Does that answer your question? But I think also the fact that she's employed by a literary journal as like a fiction editor is really very telling. Like that is an unusual career for a woman in 1850s, 1860s Russia. And that speaks to her talent and to her renown.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Walker Griggs.
Hi there. Hi there, Dr. Bowers. Thank you so much for a really great talk. I have been really getting interested in Tour recently, so I thought that was really fantastic. So I actually recently attended a talk by Hilda Hogenbaum, who I'm sure you know also works extensively on Tour, and was talking about popular. How we evaluate literature and how certain literature is rated as being either literary or sort of more popular literature. And one of the fun facts that she was talking about, which really is informed by your last comments about how at that time Tour was much more popular than what was more well known than Turgenev, is just about sale of books. I think she did a lot of research on which books were selling really well in Russia at the time. And I think, I'm just remembering from her talk, but essentially the best-selling works in the mid-19th century were French and English novels and Yevgenia Tour. So I think it's really cool how you've centered, the Jane Eyre and Tour here. I guess what I really want to ask is, do you think that there is, similar to maybe we have now, some perception of if it's popular, it must not be good? Because I think that nowadays we have a certain, understanding that, the best-selling novels are not necessarily the most highly literary ones. Was that kind of prejudice at that time?
So I have a couple, thank you for your question. I have a couple things to say. So the first one is, you need to acknowledge Hilda Hogenboom, and I'm so glad that you brought her up. So I mentioned that I have a PDF of Yevgenia Tour. I actually have PDFs of the entire Yevgenia Tour archive, like everything she's written. And that is thanks to Hilda Hogenboom, who has diligently for years gone to Russian libraries scans stuff into PDF and has a wonderful Dropbox where she shares it all. And she also has the entire Kvashinskaya archive, which I'm happy to share with people who are interested in working on women's writing. But Hilda is really revolutionary in this sense, because the stuff is not available otherwise. And it is fantastic. So the other point is that I work on the Gothic novel, and the Gothic novel is maybe an extremely good example of something that is super popular but super trashy. And so yes, there is a sense that what's popular is trashy, but I'm not sure that that entirely maps to Yevgenia Tour's work. Like, people are praising her because of her emotional sensibility, because of her craftsmanship, although they're seeing this as something that is subjective, not like an objective man writing something, right? So there is that sense that it's less good, not because it's popular, but because it's by a woman who has a different working brain than a male writer would. But I think that if you compare that to reviews that are coming out about Gothic novels also around this time and before this, there is a real sense that the Gothic novel is formulaic and bad because of its formula, whereas Yevgenia Tour's writing, no one is going to say it's formulaic, right? It's original, and that's one of the reasons why she's popular. She's writing something that no one else is writing. Does that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I sort of want to come in here with Dostoevsky and his his Gothic, because I'm sort of, yeah, not quite got my thoughts straight on that. But I think, you know, yeah, I think there is a sense of the Tour's writing being sort of, you know, seen as less good because she's a woman. But you know, sort of, has the view of the Gothic really changed in all this time? Is it still considered as, you know,
it has not. And people who are fans of Gothic novels, I'm not just talking about the 18th century Gothic here. If you think about like the Twilight phenomenon, people read Twilight because it's entertaining, but no one is going to call it great literature, right? And so it still has this kind of like trashy reputation, or reputation as being something entertaining. And if you read something that is maybe more elevated Gothic, what's an example of something that's elevated Gothic?
Rebecca,
yeah. This has kind of a higher rate of cultural capital, I guess. But that has to do with the fact that it was written by Daphne du Maurier and has been kind of become a classic, right? So when something becomes a classic, it becomes less trashy. Another example of this is Dracula. When Dracula was written, it was pretty down. I mean, it's got vampires, this kind of like sexy seduction scene, all of these things. And now it's considered to be kind of a classic novel that looks at information technologies and does interesting things with that.
And similarly with Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah, I suppose they become less Gothic as their reputation improves. Thank you.
One of the interesting things too about reviews of Gothic novels in the 19th century is that one of the serious objections to Gothic novels that were written by women is that it was absolutely appalling that women would write something so like that. Women would write these kind of like terrifying feelings. It was seen as being unwomanly, and that was one of the things that made them kind of perverse. And what's interesting about that is that also applies. So Anne Radcliffe's novels in Russia are published under Anne Radcliffe's name. A lot of other Gothic novels in Russia were also published under Anne Radcliffe's name because she was extremely popular, like putting her name on a book would sell it, including Gothic novels by men. And so a lot of these novels were reviewed as if they were women's writing and are given these kind of labels like, oh, this is absolutely terrifying, but terrifying because it comes from a woman's pen. And that includes like The Monk, for example, by Matthew Lewis, which is attributed in Russia to Anne Radcliffe and seen as perverse, not because it has to do with like incest and devil worship, but because it came from Anne Radcliffe's pen, allegedly, which is interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm looking for hands. Or if you'd like to put questions in the chat as well, please do go ahead and do that, and I can read them out for you. I think we may be at the moment. Oh, Katherine Silvich.
Hi, thank you so much.
Katherine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. It's working. Hi, thank you so much, Katya, for the great talk. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the sisters, the Tour sisters. I was really struck by the portraits that you put side by side of the Bronte sisters and the Tour sisters. And I wonder about that kind of the importance of that family life and of the sort of maybe a sisterhood to some degree in the writing that comes out. And I'm also wondering if you could say a bit about teaching with Antonina, if you have any recommendations for how to do that.
So I should say I don't know a huge amount about the Tour sisters, and I probably should know more about them. Their last name is not Tour. Tour is Yevgenia Tour's pseudonym. Her actual name escapes my mind because I'm having like a brain fart. Hold on, I will find it. Her actual name is Elizaveta Stukova Kabilina. And she had a brother and two sisters. One of the sisters became a famous artist. But as far as I know, the two sisters were not literary. And this is different than the Brontes, of course. And this is also different than the Khvostinskaya sisters, who are often called like the Brontes of Russia, where all three of the sisters in the Khvostinskaya family were literary, and all three of them writing novels. They were writing a little later, so more prominently in the 1860s. So in terms of writing, in terms of teaching Antonina, I had plans to incorporate this novel in place of Dead Souls, which I know is sacrilege to some people, in my Russian novels class this year. And I don't know how that would go. I think it will go really well because I think it will pair really well, at least in my reading of it, with Yevgeny Onegin. And it will also work well with The Idiot, which I teach in that class. But pandemic happened and I had to cut stuff from my syllabus, and the thing that I hadn't taught before was what got cut. So I can't speak to that. But if you are interested in teaching it, as I said, it is one of a handful of Russian women's works that have been translated into English. So there is an English translation from Northwestern University Press that you could use. And if you do teach it, I'll be curious to hear how it goes. It will be on my syllabus next year, I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was thinking it would be a good thing to bring in because it allows you to talk about women and sort of the female intelligentsia earlier than I typically get to them by the 1870s, 80s and stuff. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I too had the experience of sort of planning to put not Antonina, in fact, but I was going to put Double Life and City Folk and Country Folk on my 19th century syllabus this year, because they were the new texts. They were the things that got cut because of the pandemic. And that may be, sort of also quite telling in a way that those are the texts that we're only just beginning to bring in. That should probably have been there for an awful long time. I mean, Antonina was actually translated quite a while ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was translated, I think, about 15 years ago. A Double Life, I have taught A Double Life, and it's lovely. And that one has been out in an English translation for quite a while, although the updated translation is really good. Where, yeah, she's updated her translation. It's
I must buy a new version then, because I only have the old edition. So.
Yeah, the new one just came out, I think, last year with Russian Library, and Barbara Helt updated the translation herself and wrote a new introduction.
Great. Yes, I must get hold of that. I one thing to sort of say about Yevgeny Tour's family as well. Sokolov Kabulin was a writer himself, wasn't he?
Yeah.
A sort of playwright, if I think, probably a far worse writer than she was.
Yes. at least in my assessment, but I haven't read very much by him, but I also didn't really enjoy reading what I read by him.
I remember having the same experience of reading bits and pieces and really not sort of thinking it was worth pursuing very much.
Yeah, everyone should just read Evgenia Tour instead.
Absolutely, yes. Any other questions before we just... Kate, hi.
Hi, yeah, I was thinking about also about the teaching. So I've taught Antonina, and it didn't go very well. But I think it was because of the context. And actually, from your talk, it was in a novel in the family course. It was the first time I'd taught it. Students didn't really know what was going on, and I think a lot more context would have been helpful. But now today in your talk, I was thinking about how great it would be to teach it alongside Turgenev. And you know how much the light, in fact, your talk cast on the Turgenev Diary of a Superfluous Man, and I think you know also that just how helpful it is to read these sort of works by women writers that we haven't traditionally taught, and how those kind of affect these canonical works that often are included, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is another story by Turgenev as well, which he published as a response to Antonina. So, well, I mean, he published it and it does respond to Antonina. It takes specific parts of Antonina and kind of where he's kind of seems to metaphorically kill off women in Diary of a Superfluous Man, he actually kills them off in this text, which came out in 1858. And it is also really interesting to read in this context. The longer piece that this is based on, the book chapter, looks at these three texts kind of in dialogue with each other. So the Diary of a Superfluous Man, then Antonina as a response to it, then they're fighting about, they're kind of like critical fighting, his review of her work, her response to him, and then that last text that he writes where he just kind of like, I don't know, for lack of a better word, throws her kind of under the bus, right? He's over having a heroine who has an internal life by that story. And it's a very, I think it would be really interesting to read them in dialogue in a class together. Although after reading all of this critical writing about critical writing by Turgenev and also Turgenev's letters where he describes meeting Tor, I just feel really angry at Turgenev. So it's hard for me to teach it. You know.
Yeah, I was feeling exactly the same when you were talking about that. Walker is asking the question which I was going to ask, which is what is the name of the 1858 story that responds to Antonina? And
I am looking it up because I am misremembering exactly what it is. Give me one sec. It is Nishasnaya.
Nishasnaya.
Yeah. There is a very good article by Jane Costlow. So whereas I take a Gothic view, so I'm reading the Gothic in these texts, there's also already been critical scholarship on these different texts and their engagement with Antonina. The first is Jehan Gaith talking about the connection between Tor and Turgenev, and specifically Diary of a Superfluous Man. And the second is Jane Costlow's article, which is specifically, it was in Slavic Review, and it's about the dialogue between Nishasnaya and Antonina.
Thank you. That's really useful. Yeah, because I don't think I've read that Nishasnaya.
It'll make you angry.
Turgenev does anyway. So. Any more questions? I mean, I was also wondering, sort of, again on this Turgenev connection. Did Turgenev particularly single out Tor in this way, or was he in the habit of responding to women writers in this sense?
So I haven't read a lot of Turgenev's responses to other women writers. But he did seem particularly angry at Tor in his reviews. Like his review of Plemianitsa was particularly devastating, I think, for her, precisely because she had thought up till then that they had some level of friendship, right? Because up until he published this review, she had corresponded with him. She had asked if they could co-write something together. She thought everything was fine, and then he published this review that basically tore apart her writer's craft and said that, you know, she wasn't quite as good as this objective realism that other people were writing. And I think she found it really surprising. She's clearly still angry about it in her correspondence later. But in terms of other female writers, I honestly don't know. I would guess Turgenev, being Turgenev, that he does, but I don't really know. He does seem to say dismissive things about Georges Sand. He does seem to say dismissive things about Yelena Gan. I would guess he says dismissive things about other people, but I have not read those reviews.
They may well be best avoided.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, you know, I like Turgenev's writing. I liked it better before I did this research, I will say, and sort of figured out this kind of context. And once you kind of see a lot of his dismissiveness, it is hard to go back and read his writing and see what he's doing there. And kind of feel good about reading it. I don't know. Part of the sheen of Turgenev has been lost for me from figuring out how he fit into these kind of critical dialogues during this time, which is sad.
But yeah, maybe a more realistic view of him. And I wonder sort of what that says as well about the female characters in his other fiction, in his more his more famous novels.
Yeah.
Which maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Oh God.
I was gonna say something about women in Fathers and Sons, but I think I'm good. I think I'll keep it to myself.
Kate.
Yeah, I have one more question, and this came up the other day in a reading group session that was devoted to Avdotia Panayeva, and it was about basically the late 1840s as a period of publication, and how you know how little Russian stuff came out in that period. So it's just and given the publication of the translation of Jane Eyre and so on, I was wondering if any of whether you had any light to shed on this question of sort of the post 1848 kind of sort of the slump, or sort of the lack of things coming out in that period, or whether you know what light you can cast on that kind of odd period of Russian literature.
In terms of much more Western European work coming out in Russian journals than Russian work.
Yes, yeah, and sort of there being this sort of obviously ideologically, right, in the regime post 1848, there's the intellectual kind of chill in a sense, right, as well. And so I was just wondering whether that plays into the work that you've done at all.
It does not, and it's interesting. It's interesting to know about that. I feel kind of ignorant not having known a lot about that. All I knew was that I don't know a lot of Russian writers who were writing around this time. Like if I have to name texts that are coming out, I can't think of them, but I thought that was my own ignorance. But I mean, the phenomenon of Western European literature being published alongside Russian writers or being published exclusively in journals around this time is not surprising. And the fact that like when Jane Eyre comes out and the translator is comparing it to Thackeray, right? That he can make that comparison, that everyone would have been reading Thackeray as well, because this is what's coming out, is kind of interesting to me as well. What I find really interesting about all of this is not the fact, this is going off topic because I don't actually know a lot about your question. But one thing that I want to point out that's really interesting is that because of the way that translation works, things that come out in a certain order or in a certain chronology elsewhere, so will prompt certain discussions, come out simultaneously in Russia. So like, for example, Jane Eyre comes out simultaneously with Nietyczka, like the same year, right? She's coming out just shortly before or around the same time that Evgenia Tur is beginning to publish, but she would have come out earlier, several years earlier in Britain, and be compared with completely different works. Whereas Dickens is also coming out around the same time for the first time, whereas Dickens had come out a good, 10, 15 years earlier, starting in Britain. So the dialogue that's taking place in the Russian criticism is different, chronologically speaking, and I think that's really interesting. Oh, it doesn't answer your question.
That's okay.
And I wonder how much of that is, I mean, yeah, I think there is in the late 1840s, I mean, it is just, to a certain extent, there is a sort of changing of the guard with you sort of, not only, I suppose, Dostoevsky's arrest and Herzen moving abroad, Bielinski dying and so on, though it does actually feel like there's a bit of a sort of clear out at that point, and there's not anything at that point to really replace it. Even though Turgenev's already started publishing by then, he doesn't really sort of make, there's not so much of a market first. But and then I sort of wonder whether it is a sort of post-Petrushevsky sort of real sense of that it is actually really quite a difficult time, particularly difficult to write. And so people are just sort of holding off or just doing other things at this stage.
Yeah,
Or boring explanations, but.
I could imagine that being true. I can't say specifically because I don't know enough about it, which is embarrassing.
No, that's me neither, which is why I asked the question, because it just came up the other day. And yeah.
Are there any other questions? I wonder whether we're all sort of so tired at the end of term that we're sort of just running out of steam for some of these talks, because it's just sort of looking back through my notes and can't actually find any other questions.
Also, what I find when I present my research is that often people they don't quite know a lot about the Gothic, so that's already a challenge. And then with this talk in particular, which, as I said, I've done in different versions a couple of times, most people also don't know a lot about Evgenia Tur, and so it's kind of a double challenge to come up with a question that has to do with it. But I really appreciate the questions I've had so far, and I need to reiterate that people should read Tur. She's great.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I read. I think I read Antonina when the translation first came out. I've not been back to it, and I've not read anything else by her. So I need to go back and read some. And I'm really interested to read this review of the Gaskell actually. One thing I'm thinking of is this is going completely off topic. Not entirely off topic. Thinking about women's theoretical writing in the 19th century, of which there is nothing translated, literally nothing translated. Sort of thing, I was thinking about sort of how to reform my syllabus for a Russian thought course with some women writers. So far, I've managed to put in a section of Vera Figner's memoirs, because that's literally only which is obviously written much later, but this is pretty much the only thing I've been able to find. And I've come to the conclusion that actually I need to translate these things myself, or indeed find sort of get together with other people to translate and publish these things. Because there isn't a huge amount of, maybe I'm wrong about this actually, there's not a huge amount of theoretical writing by women at this time.
No, one of the, I don't remember if I said this in this talk, but I definitely say it in my book, during this time, and certainly for a lot of the 19th century, women's participation in publicistica is largely taking place within fiction. So that there are a lot of examples of women putting forward ideas in their fiction, but not necessarily engaging in critical discourse, like in thick journals. Whereas there there are some works by women that come out, but certainly nothing like as many as you would expect given the number of women writers compared to the number of male writers who are writing also criticism. Yevgenia Tour was kind of unique in that sense, in that she was actually doing a lot of this editorial and review labor.
And I assume this is also because of women's perceived lack of objectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
They're not seen as suitable for that sort of writing. But yeah, of course, thinking about stories like Sofia Sobolyova's Pros and Cons,
Mm-hmm.
very much a sort of a tract smuggled into a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Which actually might maybe something that gets put onto my course at some point in the absence of other things. So yeah, that is it. And I mean, the other thing I was thinking about, this whole question of reading, which is obviously, is a huge trope in Gothic literature, and you talked about that sort of really, sort of how that compares in Jane Eyre and in Antonina, and it's all over Russian literature. It's actually hard to think of a Russian novel in which reading, particularly a Russian novel which involves women, and perhaps it is connected to women more, but the connection between reading, the depictions of reading in the Russian novel seem to be absolutely everywhere. It's sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's actually, there's a 3-volume history of Russian reading that's being published by Damiano Rabicini and Raffaele Vicena, which is slowly coming out. So the first volume hasn't been published yet, but the second and third volumes have been published. And it's been coming out all this year. And you can find it, it's open access on their Designy press. And some of the pieces there look at historical reading, and some of them look at reading within fiction.
Thank you. And I must actually sort of get the reference for that from you, because I would want to read that. Yeah. So I have a question from Rachel Morley. Katya, do you know whether Tur's works were translated into French and read there in her lifetime at all? I think her husband was French. I'm wondering whether Flaubert might have known of her work.
I honestly don't know. I would also be interested to know, however, and that's a very good point, Rachel. I should look for that. Because what I'm interested in now, having done this work, is where she was read outside of Russia, because she wasn't published that much after the initial publication of her works. And I'm interested. It would be interesting to see how she fits into kind of broader discourses. I could see Flaubert, I could see how Flaubert would be interested in her works, but I also do not know, Emma Bovary's taste for the Gothic. I also do not know if she was being read in France, but I should say that the work that she's producing is very much in keeping with a lot of the work that was coming out around this time. So like, her work is similar to George Sand, because she was reading George Sand. George Sand, very into the Gothic. And the same, this is why Jane Eyre also coming out. I mean, she's reading Jane Eyre. A lot of other people are reading Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte was reading George Sand, right? And all of this is related to kind of this second wave of Gothic that's happening in the 1830s and 40s in Western Europe. And also, I would argue, in Russia.
Yeah, so there's sort of the sources for Emma Bovary and her taste for the Gothic may well be sort of more related to Jane Eyre, possibly.
Possibly, or I mean, France did have its own Gothic, homegrown Gothic novel movement, right? The École Phonétique, and it has, I mean, if you read, I'm having brain farts all day today. I'm forgetting all of these people's names, and it's terrible. Honestly, the guy who wrote Père Goriot is a very famous French writer. Balzac. Oh my God. Yes, Balzac. Thank you. The struggle is real, guys. It's morning here. I'm not a morning person. Yes, so Balzac as well is incorporating Gothic motifs in his work that is coming from this école frénétique, which is extremely popular in France at this time. And so Gothic goes into French literature, and you absolutely see it in Zola, you absolutely see it in Flaubert, you see it in a lot of works that were coming out later, not necessarily related to this English Gothic strain, and not necessarily because of something like Jane Eyre coming out.
Yeah, I think I'm sure that's true, and yeah, I mean, I know certainly that some Russian novels translation into French started somewhat before translation into English, but beyond that, I don't actually know. But then English was rather late, really, in getting to grips with Russian stuff. And by the time it did, certainly there would have been. Particularly with Tour not being republished in Russia, already, I assume, had been completely forgotten by the time that somebody like Constance Scarlett's at work.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, what you will find if you look at the PDF corpus of these novels is that they not only were they not republished, that means that they were not republished as like a single volume. Like you have a nice Brate Karamazov that's like one volume. That never happened for Tour's novels. So you have like four parts, one of them split into two halves, spread across 5 issues of a journal that are not consecutive. So it's hard to track down all the pieces of the novels.
A comment from Walker Griggs again. I don't know whether this is relevant to whether Tour was translated into French, but I do know that she herself was a translator and knew Italian. Towards the end of her life, she translated Milton, amongst others. Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
I didn't know that either. Thank you, Walker.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, either in the chat or speaking to us live? See, I think while you're sort of early in the morning and still not quite awake, we're at the end of the, some of us at least at the end of the day, and already sort of flagging somewhat. So maybe.
It is, to be fair, not that early here. It's just that my brain takes a while to wake up. It's what, 11:20?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I take a while to get going in the morning as well. But if there are no more questions at this stage, no, I can't see any hands or anybody turning their mics on. Then I think, do you know, Rose Babichev, do you know anything about the influence of Russian Gothic literature on folk songs?
It's more like the influence of folk songs on Russian Gothic literature. And the particular example is Vasily Zhukovsky, who he writes several kind of remakes of Borger's, what is that thing called? Lenore. It's a poem, and he revises it several times. The most famous one is called Svetlana, and he's using a lot of Russian folk motifs in these. And another famous example of this would be Tatiana's dream in Yevgeny Onegin, where she's being chased by this bear, also has these Russian folk motifs that come out and kind of work together with the Gothic. And then another example of that would be Gogol's incorporation of a kind of folk horror in his Ukrainian tales. So, I mean, the folklore existed before, and then the Gothic emerged as a literary form, kind of playing on that, because these are folk tales that everyone is familiar with.
Although in the case of Gogol, he also made up folk theme, folk stuff.
Absolutely.
In the case of Lee, which you made
but
up.
also, I mean, playing on this genre of the folk tale that everyone was familiar with, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, folk absolutely came first.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think that's probably.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate all the questions, comments we got. It's really helpful.
Yeah, it's been this has been a really really interesting talk. It's so incredibly rich, and as Kate Holland was saying, actually really fruitful to put these texts together and talk about the dialogue between them. I think it's a really great way of working, and I'm so looking forward to seeing your book and being able to read more about this. So I'd like to thank Katya Bowers for a wonderful talk. And we've had some applause, but I'd also like to do some proper applause, if we may. And say thank you, and good night to you all.